Indian sati, widow, burning. A crowd gathers around the funeral pyre. On top of the stacked logs lies the body of her husband, motionless, already soaked in oils and cloth. Next to it is his widow, a living being dressed in scarlet clothes, her eyes filled with horror. She is tied with garlands, smeared with sandalwood paste, and led by men from her own family to the pyre, as if to an altar. The cries are drowned out by the beating of drums, the mantras of the Brahmins, and the smell of burning oil. At this moment, her life ceases to belong to her. Tradition demands that the widow share her husband's fate to burn with him. This is sati, a ritual of self-immolation that for centuries was considered the highest virtue of women in India. The origins of this practice go back thousands of years. The first mentions of widow burning are found in inscriptions from the 4th and 5th centuries, although historians believe that the ritual was known as early as the Gupta period. The word sati comes from the name of the goddess, wife of Shiva, who, unable to bear her husband's insult, threw herself into the fire. This mythological story became a justification for real women. A widow was supposed to prove her loyalty by following her husband into death. Over time, the ritual became established in Hindu texts. Some Puranas and commentaries on the laws of Manu stated that a woman who died on her husband's funeral pyre purified 7 generations of her family and attained paradise. A widow who survived was considered unhappy, cursed, and unclean. She was required to wear white, cut her hair, give up jewelry, and live in isolation and deprivation. Her life became a shadow. Death on the pyre became not only a religious feat, but also a social escape from future humiliation. Historians note that sati was particularly widespread among the military and aristocratic castes. For the Rajputs in medieval India, this ritual was part of a cult of honor. Women of noble families committed johar en masse, collective self-immolation, if their fortress was besieged by enemies. Hundreds of women and girls threw themselves into the flames to avoid falling into the hands of the conquerors. Chronicles describe these scenes as heroic, but behind the beautiful words lay tragedy. Bodies were piled up, and the flames consumed those who had no choice. In villages, however, sati often took the form of coercion. A young widow, sometimes a girl of 14 or 15, remained with her husband's family. Her future was bleak. Poverty, humiliation, a useless life. Death at the stake was presented as the only way out. Brahmins convinced people that a widow who escaped sati would bring misfortune to the entire family, and her own relatives refused to take her back. In such conditions, voluntariness was a fiction. The woman could be drugged with opium, tied up, or held back from the pyre until the fire consumed her. Travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries recorded cases where widows tried to escape but were pushed back into the flames with bamboo sticks. Official chronicles of the Mughal Empire confirm that emperors tried to restrict the practice but did not abolish it completely. Akbar the Great issued a decree in the 16th century allowing sati only with the woman's consent and prohibiting violent cases. His grandson Jahangir tried to continue this line, but locally, especially in rural communities, the ritual continued to exist. Local rulers and priests resisted. For them, sati was not only a religion, but also a symbol of caste superiority. When the British arrived in India, they came face to face with this custom. From the end of the 18th century, officials of the East India Company began to record cases of self-immolation in Bengal, where sati was particularly widespread. In one region alone, hundreds of women could be burned to death in a single year. In 1813, reports mentioned more than 800 recorded cases. The real numbers were higher. Not all rituals were recorded in official documents. The British initially tried to remain neutral. They justified their passivity with respect for local culture. But European missionaries and Indian reformers launched a campaign against the ritual. Of particular importance was Ram Mohan Roy, a thinker and social activist, who in the 1820s openly opposed sati, calling it barbaric. Under pressure from public protests and humanitarian movements, Governor-General William Bentinck signed a law in 1829 declaring the practice illegal and equating it with murder. But the ban did not mean the end. Throughout the 19th century, secret cases of sati were recorded. In remote villages, widows were still forced to throw themselves into the fire, sometimes under the guise of a religious ceremony. The British administration fought against this, but the size of the country and resistance from local elites prevented the practice from being completely eradicated. Sati became a symbol of a terrible contradiction. Mass violence and the destruction of women's lives were hidden under the guise of religious devotion. Thousands of women who could have lived on, worked, and raised children were sacrificed on the altar of tradition. Their cries were drowned out by the sounds of mantras and drums, and their deaths were justified by words of purity and virtue. European travelers and officials who visited India in the 18th and 19th centuries left numerous accounts of sati. These descriptions, dry and matter-of-fact, turn the deaths of strangers into reports, but it is precisely in them that the cruel reality of the ritual emerges. Letters and diaries contain passages that are still shocking even centuries later. A British officer in Bengal wrote in 1789, "The widow, young, not more than 16 years old, was dressed in red. Her relatives led her to the pyre, and a crowd gathered around. She was seated next to her husband's body, her legs trembling, her hands clenched until her knuckles turned white. When the fire rose, she tried to stand up, but two men immediately threw themselves on her, holding her in the flames. Her cries could be heard throughout the village, but the crowd began to chant mantras loudly, drowning out her voice. Such scenes were not uncommon. Travelers reported that in most cases, widows did not go voluntarily. They were pushed, given opium or wine to suppress their resistance. Sometimes the woman was tied up and covered with wood, leaving her no way to escape. A French doctor working in Calcutta described a case where a widow, feeling the heat, jumped out of the fire and rushed to the people for help. Her relatives grabbed her and threw her back into the fire. For them, the shame of her escape was worse than her screams. Sati gradually turned into a public spectacle. The higher the status of the family, the larger the event. Hundreds of spectators could gather at the ceremony. Drums were played, hymns were read, sweets and money were distributed. For the crowd, it was a holiday. For the victim, it was torture that lasted for hours. Witnesses wrote that sometimes the widow did not die immediately. Her body writhed in the fire until the flesh cracked and the bones were charred. The crowd watched and prayed, convinced that a sacred act was taking place. The priests played a special role. They accompanied the ritual with chants, claiming that the widow was ascending to heaven. For them, the woman's death was not a tragedy, but a prophet. Relatives brought offerings. and part of the family's property went to the temple. Thus, the priesthood had a direct interest in maintaining the tradition. Widows from the lower castes suffered even more. While a widow from the upper class could hope for honors, poor women were often burned without ceremony. The East India Company's reports mention cases where a widow was simply thrown onto her husband's burning pyre, without preparation and without mantras. Her cries were silenced by brute force. In villages, the widow could be dragged to the pyre by the entire community to show that her life was worthless without her husband. No less horrific were the collective satis, or joharas. When Muslim armies besieged Rajput fortresses, women and children gathered in underground chambers and lit huge bonfires. Chronicles describe how hundreds of women, sometimes with babies in their arms, entered the flames, preferring death to slavery. Chronicle writers portrayed this as a heroic act, but for the women themselves it was a choice between fire and the violence of the enemy. Their bodies were reduced to charcoal, and their story became a myth of honor in which the voice of the victim was no longer heard. The British recorded statistics. In 1818 alone, more than 800 cases were reported in Bengal. The real figures, as officials themselves admitted, were higher. Many rituals took place without witnesses from the colonial authorities. In official documents, the figures were accompanied by a dry note. The tradition continues. There was no mention of pain or screams in these reports, only numbers. But there were also cases of resistance. In 1823 in Calcutta, a young widow broke free from her relatives and refused to enter the pyre. She publicly declared that she did not want to die. Her words caused an uproar. The crowd began to shout, demanding that she be returned to the fire, and the priests said that she would bring a curse upon the village. But British officials intervened and saved the woman. This was one of the episodes that strengthened the movement against sati. Nevertheless, in most cases, widows had no way out. Their bodies became symbols of devotion, and their deaths were justified by words of virtue. Families were proud that their women had burned with dignity. But behind this pride lay silence. The silence of those who could not scream because smoke and flames had robbed them of their last breath. The 19th century was a time of fierce confrontation over sati. On the one hand, Indian reformers and the British administration, who increasingly denounced the practice as murder. On the other, Brahmins and conservative communities, for whom widow self-immolation was a symbol of fidelity and religious purity. In this struggle, women's bodies remained the arena of ideological conflict. Ram Mohan Roy, a thinker, educator, and one of the first Indian reformers, played a special role in history. He himself witnessed sati. A close relative of his died on a pyre. From then on, he dedicated his life to fighting this practice. Roy wrote pamphlets, published articles in Bengali and English, and wrote for Calcutta newspapers. His arguments were extremely rational. Sati has no solid basis in Hindu scriptures. It is used by priests to control women and for material gain, and most importantly, it destroys lives and robs society of its future. He argued that widows had the right to live and raise their children rather than being sacrificed on a pyre. His writings caused an uproar. Brahmins accused him of betraying tradition and insulting the gods. But Roy's ideas found support among some educated Indians and missionaries. By the early 1820s, the movement against sati had become noticeable. Discussions took place on the streets of Calcutta, and fierce debates raged in the newspapers. But the rituals continued. In 1829, Governor General William Bentinck took a decisive step. After a series of public scandals, when European witnesses wrote about horrific scenes, he signed a law banning sati in Bengal. This act declared widow self-immolation a criminal offense, and those who participated in its preparation or coercion murderers. For the British administration, this was a risk. Interference in religious practices threatened uprisings. But the law was passed, and sati officially became a crime. However, the reality was more complicated. In the first months after the ban, cases of secret self-immolation were reported. Widows were still dying, but now it happened under the cover of night on remote bonfires. Relatives secretly prepared the pyres, priests blessed the ceremony, and crowds gathered around to hide it from officials. The British understood that each case was a challenge to the law. Trials began, and priests and relatives were arrested. The confrontation intensified. Conservative Hindus argued that the law was an insult to their faith and interference by the colonial authorities in sacred customs. They wrote petitions, organized meetings, and demanded that the ban be lifted. The British, meanwhile, used reformers like Roy as an ideological shield, claiming that the fight against sati was not an imposition of Western values, but support for progressive Indians. Meanwhile, newspapers continued to publish reports of new cases. In 1830, more than 60 self-immolations were recorded in one district of Bengal alone, despite the ban. Officials described the scenes in their reports. A widow, about 17 years old, was drugged with opium, placed on a pyre, and held down by relatives until the fire engulfed her. These documents, dry and bureaucratic, sound scarier than any chronicle. There are no emotions, only facts. But behind every line, there is a life. In the second half of the 19th century, the scale of sati began to decline. The ban gradually took effect, and the British police intervened more and more often. But cases continued until the end of the century. Sometimes widows themselves asked to be allowed to commit sati, believing that otherwise they would be cursed. Sometimes they were forced to do so. Deaths became increasingly rare, but each one was a reminder that tradition does not disappear immediately. It is kept alive by fear and social pressure. A widow who refused to commit sati became an outcast. She had to wear white, cut her hair, refuse food and jewelry, and live on alms. In society, she was called a manglik, meaning unhappy and cursed. She became a shadow, living in poverty, subjected to ridicule and violence. For many women, the prospect of such a life was worse than death by fire. And it was this social pressure, not religious belief, that made sati such a persistent practice. By the end of the 19th century, the ritual had almost disappeared in cities, but isolated cases still occurred in rural areas of Bengal, Rajasthan, and central India. British reports from the 1890s noted, "The practice has been reduced to a minimum, but isolated cases of self-immolation continue." Thus, the 19th century was a time of slow decline for sati, but not its complete end. Even after the laws, even after the protests of reformers and threats from the colonial police, women continued to burn on pyres. Their deaths became not only a personal tragedy, but also a battlefield between tradition and modernization, religion and politics, life and death. In the 20th century, sati began to be talked about as a relic of the past, supposedly remaining only in chronicles and textbooks. But the reality turned out to be more complicated. The ritual did not disappear completely. It hid in rural areas, in traditionalist communities, where the law and the state were distant, and power belonged to elders and Brahmins. Sometimes widows continued to be pushed into the fire, albeit without public processions, under the cover of night and silence. Official reports from British India at the beginning of the century recorded isolated cases in Rajasthan and central India. But after independence in 1947, the issue returned to the spotlight. Independent India adopted a constitution that proclaimed gender equality, and in the 1950s, Parliament reaffirmed an old British law that declared sati a crime. However, in the villages, the memory of the ritual lived on. Widows were still treated as outcasts. They had to wear white clothes, refuse food and jewelry, and be isolated from society. The life of a widow remained a heavy stigma. Although there were few official cases of self-immolation, the very idea of a virtuous death continued to exist in the culture. In films, religious songs, and folk tales, the widow sati was portrayed as a saint, a woman who sacrificed herself for her family and husband. By the middle of the century, it seemed that the practice had finally disappeared. But in the 1970s and 1980s, India faced alarming signs. Sociologists began to record rumors of the return of sati in some villages. Newspapers reported on voluntary self-immolations. The culmination was a tragic incident in 1987, when an 18-year-old woman named Rup Kanwar died on her husband's funeral pyre in the village of Deval, Rajasthan. This story shook the country. Rup Kanwar's husband had died of illness, and a few hours later she was taken to the funeral pyre. A crowd of several hundred people gathered around the pyre. Priests recited mantras, men and women surrounded the pyre, and drums drowned out the cries. The official version, spread by supporters of the ritual, was that Rup voluntarily entered the fire. But eyewitness accounts told a different story. She was held back, pushed into the flames, and when she tried to get out, people pulled her back. After Rup Kanwar's death, her image was quickly turned into a cult. A memorial was erected in the village. She was called Sati Mata, Holy Mother, and pilgrimages were made to the site of her death. Men and women brought flowers, lit candles, and asked for blessings. Thus, a ritual that was officially a crime became a religious miracle in the eyes of part of society. The state's reaction was harsh and belated. The authorities arrested several dozen people, including relatives and priests, but most were soon released. The case dragged on for years, and in the end, almost all of the defendants were acquitted. This case became a symbol of how, even at the end of the 20th century, the law remained weaker than tradition. After the 1987 tragedy, the Indian Parliament passed a new law, the Sati Prevention Commission, which toughened penalties. Now, not only participation in the ritual was considered a criminal offense, but also its glorification. Memorials, religious practices, songs, and pilgrimages related to sati were banned. The authorities promised that the tragedy of Rup Kanwar would be the last. But reports of secret cases continued to emerge in the 1990s. Sati in the 20th century became a mirror. It showed that even after reforms, constitutions, and parliamentary debates, women in villages still lived under the yoke of tradition. Their bodies continued to be subject to control, their fates sacrificed to myths of honor and purity. Feminist organizations in India launched a campaign. They held demonstrations, wrote articles, and demanded investigations. Their slogan was simple: Sati is murder. But they were opposed by traditionalists who argued that it was a woman's freedom of choice and part of our culture. Sati became a battleground between modernists and conservatives, between life and death. Even in the 21st century, the Indian press sometimes reports rare cases of widows dying in fires under mysterious circumstances. Officially, these are suicides, but unofficially, they are echoes of an old ritual. Each such report sounds like an echo from the distant past that refuses to fade away. Today, sati is more often talked about as a thing of the past, but its ghosts continue to live on in modern India. And not only in villages, where the law is slow to catch up, but also in the culture, in the memory, in the way society views widows. Bonfires have long been banned, but the memory of women who burned with dignity is still reproduced in rituals, songs, and memorials. After Rup Kanwar's death in 1987, her village became a place of pilgrimage. People came from all over the country to worship the Sati Mata. A marble slab was erected at the site of the pyre, gifts were brought, and prayers were said. Despite the direct prohibition of the law, the cult persisted. The police periodically dispersed the pilgrims and arrested the priests, but after a few weeks everything resumed. This popular sanctity showed that for part of society, sati remained an ideal of female self-sacrifice. The state tried to fight back. The Prevention of Sati Act explicitly prohibited any form of glorification, including songs, monuments, and gatherings. Violators faced prison terms. In the 2000s, Indian courts heard several cases against activists who distributed images of sati or called for voluntary self-immolation. But each case was accompanied by protests. Thousands of people took to the streets to defend the tradition of their ancestors. Widowhood in India remains one of the bleakest reminders that burning bodies has not gone away. It has simply taken on a different form. According to human rights organizations, at the beginning of the 21st century, there were several million widows living in poverty and isolation in the country. In the cities of Vrindavan and Varanasi, there are entire neighborhoods where outcast widows live. They wear white, shave their heads, live on alms, and sing prayers. They are called living shadows because for society, they are no longer women. They are symbols of misfortune, misery, and a reminder of death. Some widows end up in these communities as teenagers. Their husbands die in their 20s or 30s, while they themselves are only 15 or 16. Their lives are cut short just as they are beginning. Widows cannot remarry, cannot work, and many are sexually exploited by those who should be protecting them. They do not burn in the flames of a bonfire, but their lives turn into a slow, drawn-out sati, a daily self-immolation in poverty and lawlessness. Modern Indian feminists and human rights activists call this social sati. They emphasize that although physical fires are prohibited, the very structure of society continues to kill widows by depriving them of their rights, dignity, and future. In Indian culture, the image of a woman who sacrifices herself for her husband is still found in cinema and religious literature. In schools in some regions, stories about valiant satis are still told, without mentioning that behind the beautiful myth, there were screams and violence. Even in the 21st century, the press occasionally reports tragedies suspiciously reminiscent of sati. In 2002, in the state of Madhya Pradesh, a 60-year-old widow died on her husband's funeral pyre. Officially, it was called suicide, but eyewitnesses said she was surrounded by a crowd and priests were singing hymns. In 2006, in Rajasthan, There was a case where a widow threw herself into a funeral pyre, and the village immediately began to build a memorial for her. The authorities dismantled it, but the attempt itself showed how strong the tradition is. All this suggests that sati has not died out completely. It has transformed, sinking into the cultural fabric and memory. It exists as a myth about the virtuous woman, as the reality of widow poverty, and as rare outbreaks of violence that the authorities try to label suicide. The feminist perspective on sati is particularly clear. It is not a religious feat, but systemic violence in which women are deprived of choice. For centuries, their bodies were turned into torches, their deaths into celebrations, and their suffering into legends. In the 21st century, India banned the pyres, but the very idea of the sacrificial woman lives on in the culture. And as long as widows remain living shadows, as long as their lives are turned into slow self-immolation, sati is not over. It has merely changed its form. And that is why the story of sati today sounds not like a forgotten chronicle, but like an alarming reminder. Traditions that make you want to scream do not disappear on their own. They go deeper, hide behind masks of religion and honor, but continue to take away women's only right, the right to life.